So, here's what we're going to start with. After World War II, if you're not there, get there. After World War II. After the unconditional surrender of Germany in World War II, the Allies met at Potsdam, Germany, to decide the fate of post-war Europe. Germany had been divided into 4 occupation zones. You can see these on your picture. They're color-coded and have a flag. They're British, American, French, and Soviet zones. The capital city of Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, everybody see that? How it's right in the middle of East Germany? Was divided in a similar way. The British, French, and Americans were allowed access over land and through 3 air corridors. So basically, we split Germany into 4 chunks. Now some of you know what's going to happen. You NATO countries, Great Britain, France, United States, each had a chunk of Germany. See how they're all in the West, though? You're going to come back around and say, let's unify and make West Germany. The Soviets have their own chunk, and the key thing, even though it's not as big, it has the capital city of Berlin. The weird thing is, Berlin's smack dab in the middle of East Germany, but we split the city in half and said West Berlin is your guys' to administer, even though it's smack dab in the middle of East Germany. Does that seem kind of like a goofy decision? It's kind of a geographical problem. You'll understand why that's a big deal tomorrow. Okay? There are 2 factors that must be taken into consideration when trying to understand why the post-war map of Europe was eventually agreed to by the West, or better stated, allowed this to happen. Okay? Number 1, Bentley. The Soviets' willingness to suffer catastrophic casualties and their disregard for the sacredness of human life in general. This is mostly attributed to their leader, Joseph Stalin. AKA, the Soviets don't care when their people die. If you don't recall, 20 million Soviets died in World War II. By far the most of any country. To put that in perspective, America lost somewhere around 400,000. That is absolutely nothing compared to 20 million. And the worst thing is they didn't really care. Okay? The West also put a premium on human life, and they were sick of the death and destruction that the war had caused. The evidence of these 2 theories played out multiple times in the way both sides conducted the war. Stalin clearly used this to his advantage as the Soviets closed the Iron Curtain on Eastern Europe. You know what that is from class. The Iron Curtain is a reference to the Soviet Union sealing off Eastern Europe from the West. By 1949, the West had come to the conclusion that all communist countries were the enemy. Okay, so next page you should see NATO and Warsaw Pact, and there's a little NATO symbol. Kind of looks like a compass. And then a Warsaw Pact symbol. It's a red star with 2 hands shaking in front of that. Our friends, the United States, could you read that paragraph for us, please?
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was signed on April 4th, 1949. This alliance was built on the idea of collective defense against a Soviet invasion. The Warsaw Pact was organized in 1955 and was led and dominated by the Soviet Union. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is not organized in a uniform defense like the Warsaw Pact. In the Warsaw Pact, the Soviets dedicated procedures, strategies, and all the units are equipped with Soviet military equipment. In other words, all Warsaw Pact forces are led by the Soviet leadership and have the same training and equipment. NATO, on the other hand, is a collection of different national forces loosely led by the United States.
Okay, so translation. Those of you at this table, you have your own armies, your own tanks, your own aircraft, your own philosophies, and you all kind of vote on what to do together. That is in stark contrast to our friends at this table. Okay? The Warsaw Pact countries, if you have tanks in your army, they are Soviet tanks that they gave you. They're all the same. Your guys are trained the same way. When it comes to making a decision, there's no such thing as like, I vote this. Essentially, you do what Comrade Stalin says because he's in charge. Now, there are advantages to both ways of doing things, right? So don't think you're better or they're worse. But that's how these alliances are organized. Okay, so now the Marshall Plan. France, as a big recipient of the Marshall Plan, could you read that paragraph for us, please?
The U.S. State Department put together a plan to aid countries in Europe who needed help recovering from the Second World War. It was named after former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States Armed Forces, George C. Marshall. It was also thought that this aid would prevent the further spread of communism. The United States felt that the lesson of the Treaty of Versailles wanted to help countries recover instead of punishing them for the war. The West also felt that a strong Western Europe was the best defense against communism. This aid package was offered to the Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union later refused.
Okay, so you guys also know this. To rebuild all these countries, especially Germany and France and Great Britain, the United States is basically going to give everybody a pile of cash. But there was a catch. What could you buy with that American cash we'd give to countries like France and Germany after the war?
American goods.
American-made stuff. So it's kind of a win-win for us. We'll loan you money to buy stuff back from us. Now, the Soviets and their countries in Eastern Europe were offered the same deal as you Western countries. The Soviets said, no thank you, we don't want your money. And here's what you have to remember. Did the Soviet Union suffer greatly during World War II?
Heck yes.
Could they have used the money to rebuild their country and their 20 million lives that were lost?
Yeah.
But they said no, and we won't let any Eastern European countries take it. Okay, so that's kind of how we get here. Now, what you should see after that, kind of the next thing, it says Cold War operations, and it's got tanks and nuclear forces on there. Okay, that should be the next thing in your binder. Cold War operations. And this one's going to be a couple pages long, so if you're unclipping stuff, let me show you. The first one says Cold War Operations Manual with the tanks, just like my screen. The last page of that has our seating arrangement. It says decision-making process. So this should be the second thing in your binder. So it starts with Cold War Operations and ends with decision-making process. Take those 6 pages and put them as the next thing in your binder after the World Situation Summary. Stuff about like nuclear weapons and tanks. Yep, so is that the second thing in your binder? After what we just read.
Wait, and then this has to go through?
So listen, this whole thing is all one set here. It starts with Cold War Operations Manual with the tanks, that's page 1. There should be 5 more pages behind that. I'm just scrolling through so you can see the next 5 pages. The last one of these has decision-making process and our seating arrangement on it. Take those and make sure they're the second thing in your binder. If you're responsible for a second country today, make sure their binder is set up correctly as well, please. That'll save us time later this week. Now, these are basically the rules of how things work. You are sitting with an alliance. Now, Comrade Cuba, since you are communist as of the 1950s, which, anybody read the news about President Obama yesterday? He went to Cuba and is the first president since Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s to visit Cuba. Remember how you can't buy Cuban cigars and you can't go there on spring break? Obama's trying to kind of reopen our relationship with Cuba. Him and his wife and his kids are there right now. First president in almost 100 years to go there. Short story, you guys know the Cuban Missile Crisis from last week. They've been communist since the 1950s, and we tried to get our friends, the Cuban nationals, to invade them in 1960, the Bay of Pigs. They got slaughtered. So the Cubans brought in some Soviet missiles in '62 to make us mad. We've had a horrible relationship with Cuba for about 60 years. President Obama's trying to make them into friends again. Now, whether that's right or wrong is a topic for another day, but he's there right now. He's the first president since Calvin Coolidge to visit Cuba. So since you are communist, I'm going to have you take your binder and join them. Here's what you guys are going to do as a team. Led by the United States, if you're NATO. Led by the Soviet Union, if you're Warsaw Pact. How do the rules work here? Now, when you go through this as a group, okay, there are a couple different types of forces and rules, and they show how they work. It will not make perfect sense. That's what today is about. Orientation. Like, orient yourself. It's going to start to make sense. So that tomorrow when we come in and say, all right, NATO, it's your turn. What do you want to do? You go, well, we understand how conventional forces work versus nuclear forces. Okay? So I will come around and help you, but your job today is to read how this Cold War Operations Manual works, and then the next thing you should see is something that says top secret with your country's name on it. That tells you your goals. So we're going to read this as a group so we know what's going on tomorrow.